Paul knew that the mother church in Jerusalem, the very first church, the church from which all the other churches came, Paul knew that the mother church in Jerusalem had fallen on hard times. The reason why this church fell on hard times was that the church in Jerusalem was facing Jewish persecution. And that Jewish persecution had caused a number of the church's members to lose their jobs. And so with a number of the members of the church of Jerusalem without a job, how could they support their families? How could they live day to day? Paul was aware of this situation, and so Paul decided that he would take up an offering from all the other Christian churches. And the money that he raised in this offering, he was going to take to the mother church in Jerusalem, so that the church there could then distribute it to aid its members who had lost their jobs due to that persecution. It was a very noble gesture on Paul's part. All the churches took part in this special mission offering, except for one church, the Corinthian church. Paul was bothered by this because, you see, the Corinthian church was the most affluent church out of all the churches. And Paul was just baffled by this. Why is it that the most affluent church had not taken part in this mission offering when all the other churches did? And so Paul decides in his second letter to this congregation that he is going to broach this subject. And he's going to try and gently nudge them to participate in this offering. Now Paul decides that he's going to tell the Corinthian church about the Macedonian church's response. The Macedonian churches were the poorest churches in the church. And Paul tells the Corinthians, let me tell you how the poor churches of Macedon responded to this free will offering. They gave generously, said Paul. In fact, they gave beyond their means. Paul hints to the church in Corinth that he originally did not even want to tell the Macedonian churches about this special offering because he knew they were poor. But the Macedonian churches found out about it and begged Paul to participate in it. So he shares that with the Corinthian church. I didn't even want to tell these churches about it, but they found out and they said, Paul, we want to participate. And then they give generously. Then Paul goes on and shares with the Corinthian church why they responded so generously. These poor congregations. He says they gave themselves first to the Lord. They gave themselves first to the Lord. And here, Paul is pointing to a truth. And that truth is this. When you give yourself to God, when you give yourself to Christ, and you start walking closely with God, generosity will flow in and out from you. Just as it did for the Macedonian churches. When you walk closely with God, generosity will flow in and out from you. Let me put it another way. It is impossible to walk closely with God and be stingy. It's impossible to walk closely with God and be stingy. The key word, closely. You can walk with God and be stingy, but I'll tell you something, your walk is going to be pretty distant. You can walk with God and be stingy, but it's going to mean that your walk is a distant walk. But if you're walking closely with God, generosity will flow from you. And here's why. If you're walking hand in hand with God every day, you realize how lucky you are. You realize how many blessings you enjoy. You realize God's grace upon your life day in and day out. And as a result of all these blessings that you are keenly aware of, thanksgiving wells up and generosity begins to flow. And you begin to realize that your gifts and graces are not meant to be hoarded, but to be shared. So if you're walking closely with God, you're going to be generous. Just as the Macedonian churches are. And if you look at your life and you say, well, I think I'm walking closely with God, but then I'm not really that generous, well, then I think you need to do some more thinking. Because your walk maybe isn't as close as you think it is. Because if you walk closely with God, generosity flows. It just flows. That's been my experience. It's been in the experience of countless other members of the churches that I've served, and I know it's been some of your experience as well. Generosity flows when we walk with God. But something else happens to us when we walk closely with God. And not only do we become generous, but we begin to realize that as we give, we get. Some of you know that. As you give, you get. And this is kind of what Jesus was getting at in the words that Dave read for us earlier in the scripture. Jesus said this to his disciples and to those who were listening as Dave read. Give, it will be given to you. See that? Give, and it'll be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use will be the measure you give. Jesus really is pointing to the making of wine here in this little illustration. The words suggest making of wine, giving the grapes, giving the sugar, giving the yeast, giving the time. You put it together, shake it together, measure it, and what you get from your giving is better than any of the gifts you've given. You get wine. Those days, I'm sure everyone agreed that wine was better than grapes. So here Jesus is saying, if you give, you get. Now, a word of caution. We do not give just to get. You hear that? We do not give just to get. But when you give, again, out of that sense of generosity, out of that sense of gratitude, out of that sense of being thankful for how blessed you are, and every one of us here today is extremely blessed. When we give, we do get. We get satisfaction. We get joy. We get the pleasure of knowing that we are giving to something greater than ourselves. We get a sense of empowering other people, or empowering the church, or empowering nonprofits with our gifts. These are the things that we get when we give. So in our scripture, we see two truths. The first truth is, as you grow in your relationship with God, walking closely with God, you will grow in your generosity. You'll grow in your generosity. As everyone walks walks closely with God. Eventually they'll grow. They'll come to the point where they're now tithing, and they'll go beyond that. That's the first truth. Walking closely with God brings about generosity. Second truth, when you give, you give. That's the way it is. You give. Pleasure, joy, satisfaction, empowerment. These are two truths that Jesus and Paul were keenly aware of and shared freely with the disciples, with the church in Corinth. We do not know how the church in Corinth responded to Paul's request. I'd like to think that they got his message and decided as a local congregation they should participate generously in the offering. But we have no idea if they did. Paul never writes again about this matter and doesn't tell us if they participated or not. But like the church in Corinth, we all have opportunities where we are given to give. Opportunities to give to the church. Opportunities to give to those nonprofits out there that are good nonprofits. Opportunities to give of time. Opportunities to give of service. We're all given opportunities to give. Our decision is a simple one. Do we respond generously, or do we respond with a token? Paul would hope that our response is generous. That's why Paul tells the church, when he shares with them once again what I read for you in the passage of Scripture. Paul ends by saying, once I get to that page, once we get to the right book. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see that you also excel